right, today we will hear the second in a series of talks to be presented in Senate this year on the topic of anti-racism. Nayama McCarthy-Brown, assistant professor in the Department of Dance, will talk about inclusion practices and culture today. Naya?
Hello, everybody. A bunch of people. I want to thank my colleague, Valerie Williams, for suggesting my name and allowing me to share some of my research with you today on anti-racism practices. I wanted to kind of situate my conversation today around inclusive practices within anti-racism. And what I would say is that anti-racism is like a tree with lots of different approaches and ways of working through this thing, right? And so inclusion and culturally relevant teaching methods, which is some of the things that I'll be focused on today, are just some of the branches that you can approach. Once you do this, or if you choose to move forward in these approaches, it doesn't make you an anti-racist. It's one tool, it's one branch, it's one piece of the puzzle, because it's a very big tree with lots of roots, right? So just wanted to kind of situate the work a little bit. First, I like to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion, because all of these different monikers get mixed up, diluted, conflated, expanded, and put together. But they really are different, and they have different ways of operating. And one of the things that's really important about inclusion and culturally relevant teaching, and when you want to expand the diversity on your campus, it can't just be about numbers and the diversity in terms of demographics. And that diversity approach tends to lead towards a lot of tokenism and no structural change and advancement in terms of progressive ideas and thinking around inclusion. It's kind of like inviting an elephant to a giraffe's house and expecting the elephant to be able to maneuver and navigate in that giraffe's house without taking into account that it was not made for an elephant, right? There has to be some structural change. And inclusion is really talking about how to make those changes, how to make curriculum relevant to all the people who are invited into the space, not just diversifying who's in the space, but diversifying the way we approach the space, the way we teach with the materials, and all of those things. So when we think about diversity and inclusion, are we talking about structure, pedagogy, our content, who's in leadership, or demographics? And without really thinking through those things, your outcomes will be indicative of the lack of target or the target, right? So the target and kind of your focus in on what you're doing is really important here. And the first thing we want to do is start with ourselves. That's where I like to start all of these initiatives, missions, whatever. Start with yourself. Who are you? And I'm going to ask you to jot a couple of notes down if you can, or you can do it in your mind if you're really organized and talented. But who are you? Who is your department? What's the identity of your department? What does it look like? Who's there? Race, class, gender, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, age, able-bodied. Is this about who we want to be, or who's actually in the room in the space? Who's there, right? And so I'm asking you to consider who you are and also who's in your unit. Two different things. Who do you relate to? If you think about the 5 people you talk to most, friends, family, relatives, colleagues, who are the people who are in your ear? Who do you relate to? Who do you connect with? Who's in your life? When I'm talking to my students, I say, pull up your Instagram. Who are you following? That's not famous, right? That's not famous. How do you relate to content and material? What are the pathways that bring you closer to material? When you see yourself in material, when you see other people in material, what are those linkages? What are those in-group messages? So one of the things I want to kind of bring you into awareness is there's a book called Racially Equitable Teaching by Mary Eric. And she talks about in-group messaging. In-group messaging is the messages you get from people who look like you, particularly race and gender. She asked volunteer teachers, the teachers volunteered themselves. They all had a social justice belief. And she asked them to submit their print materials, their magazines, their books, their content. And these were people who were deliberately focused on social justice, teachers, elementary school teachers. And she found that 70% of the print materials referred to white men, a little over 25% referred to white women. Black people were referred to 16% of the time, less than that for Latinos, and non-English native speakers were referred to less than 2% of the time. Now we can say that this is elementary school and probably our higher ed circles wouldn't lack so much diversity, right? But what we find is when we look at syllabi, a lot of times they do not have a broad reference and scale of diversity. So when I'm thinking about culturally relevant teaching practices for dance, because I'm a dance teacher, I think about things like if I'm trying to teach about patterns or quadrilles or dances from a certain time period, and I was in a community that was Hispanic, I would bring forward quinceañeras and talk about something that related to them. Or if I'm talking about rites of passage to a community of Latinos, I might bring forward quinceañeras as a rites of passage in their life. When they turn 15, they have this oftentimes a party or a big celebration. And a lot of times the ways in which they dance are in formation and order and can show certain patterns that I can then say, take that information and relate it to the content that I'm teaching right here, right? So when I'm trying to teach concepts to my son, who's a third grader, Fortnite becomes the example that I want to pull from all the time for different types of costumes or wear or movements, because he's familiar with that. He's going to get excited. And he's like, I know what you're talking about. I'm coming in with you, right? So what kinds of examples can we draw upon to allow our students in this space and also point to our students' culture and say, I see you. I know you. I understand you. This connects to you. It's very hard to do that if we ourselves don't relate to that culture or we ourselves don't know about that culture. I think about all of the times that I've invited students to a dance performance. I want to expand their world. I'm going to give them tickets to the Nutcracker, tickets to the ballet company. But when am I coming into their community to see the dances that they value? If I can't show them that I value who they are and the community they come from, it's very hard for me to get them to value what I have to say. And so student learning goes up when we connect to students and we show them that their culture matters. In addition, I did research on almost 200 graduating students from different dance departments across the country, from departments that said they valued cultural diversity. I asked those seniors to identify 3 artists of color. 120 students skipped the question. We had 20 students answering that survey that were people of color. Out of the people of color, 1 student skipped that question. The students of color all had something to say about other artists of color. And so we found that when departments were looking for resources around culturally relevant work and more diversity, they could look in their classrooms and it wouldn't be that expensive. The answers are right in the room with you. It's when we position those people, those students, those faculty members, those staff people as experts, as valuable, as holding information that we can use. And that's when we create a space that's a lot more egalitarian, that holds the views of equality and equity. So this is a time, always a time, it's always a time to look at curriculum and course content. Here are some of the things that we could be looking for in course content. All right. Does your course content do the following? Does it present history from the perspective of multiple groups of people, inclusive in the general formatting of the text? The text does not feature or isolate stories of marginalized groups, but rather centers their stories as part of a general encompassing narrative. All right, not to isolate out to the side the Native Americans, but to integrate them into our society. They're part of the community. Their experiences are impacting and touching us. Their culture contributes to our wellness and our lives. Reflect the historical perspectives and lenses of multiple diverse groups of people through acknowledging the narratives and counter narratives of diverse groups of people. Does the content avoid using language that suggests groups of people were less civilized than European Americans? Does the course content avoid using language that suggests the specific groups need help or saving? When we came along, we granted them these privileges, we granted rights, we offered this. How are the different players positioned in terms of power holding? And if those are the types of content that you have because that's accessible to you, are you teaching students to look at that content with a critical eye through critical pedagogy practices so that they're examining relationships of power in these spaces? All of this work, anti-racism, we do a session here, we do a session there, and we focus on it this way, we focus on it that way. And oftentimes these are isolated conversations and not a through line that happens every day. But this work is not about checking off a box and we put our 20 minutes in or our hour in here. It really is an ongoing work, struggle. Things are changing constantly. Language is different in different regions. It requires ongoing work all the time to stay fresh, just like we would with our research practices. It's very much similar in that way. I know that OSU has a lot of resources, and I want to direct you to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. There's a link there, but I'm sure you all know how to get to it. Also, the Curran Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. There's my typo right there. Excuse me, study, the D. I recently went through this training session, and the implicit bias modules I thought were really helpful in an opportunity for me as well as my students to process information and continue an ongoing dialogue. So my question is, what are you doing? What are you doing with the people you have access to? So I'm a professor. I have access to this semester 1 class, next semester 2 classes. So I'm thinking about what I can do with my classes because that's my realm of influence. What's your realm of influence? And what are you doing with that? What's your plan? What are you gonna do? I can tell that everybody here knows that anti-racism training and diversity, equity, inclusion are important things. So then what? If we know these are important things, then what? It becomes what do we do? And for me, a lot of times the issue is, well, how do I do that? I get the theory, but where's the practice? And so I'm here to offer strategies or ideas or anything that people might need in terms of support around the doing. But it's kind of about where's the plan now? You know, people ask me to come talk to them all of the time. Particularly, it's been heightened since the George Floyd murder. But I have to say, a lot of the times, the conversations are not much different than they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Multicultural education started off and grew really in the 1970s. And when I look at literature in my field around the conversation, it hasn't changed. They talk about privileging European dance forms in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now 2020. So it's not really about the knowing, because I believe everybody here knows, but it's about what are we doing? What's the plan? So I hope I've inspired some ideas and thinking around it. I don't know if anyone has any questions or if we have any time.
Are there questions or comments for Naya?
Thanks for the great presentation. I was just wondering, I'm a scientist. I was just wondering if you see a dichotomy between the humanities and science in the realm of diversity and inclusion. It seems to me that culturally, this is much more important in the humanities, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
I'm glad you asked that, and I've definitely evolved on my thinking about that. And it's not the same, and my comparison's very different. But I will say to you, when I started my work on diversifying dance curriculum, I would approach different teachers of different types of dance. And when I would come to ballet, they would say, not this class, we're just the technique. They learn the technique and that's it. And there's no need to diversify the teaching methods or the contents because it is what it is. The foot is pointed or it's not. And what I've learned over time is that there's tons of ways to diversify ballet curriculum. Many. I've actually written a chapter and I'm writing another book on it. The ways in which I would imagine to approach it would be to get into circles of people who are diversifying science curriculum and materials. And I think you'll find a lot is going on. But one of the things that happens in ballet is who's doing the dance, who gets to dance, whose voices are centered, whose work is centered, and why. Who is not at the table and why, right? And where are the tables in which people of color are bringing forth a lot of science innovations that people are not shining the light on because of inequity, possibly. So definitely, I would make sure that my students know that there are, whatever marginalized groups there are in science, I would shine lights on those people who are doing the thing and make sure that my students leave class knowing. And it isn't so much, it is for the marginalized students, that's true, but it's really for students who are not marginalized. They have to know that they're not the only ones that own this thing. So it's so important for them to see everybody having access and you pointing your attention to other people who aren't typically seen.
I just thank you for that presentation. I have a quick question. One of the things I've been struggling with since we've moved our bigger classes to Zoom is finding ways to get a better sense of the kind of cultural expertise and backgrounds that my students are bringing to class, not making assumptions based on a one-by-one image on my Zoom screen. And in really large classes, I don't even necessarily have that often unreliable visual evidence. I wonder if you just had any suggestions that obviously a lot of your dance classes are smaller, but in larger classes, how to get input, because in the past, so much of that would be the conversations we'd have before and after class in the hallways would allow me to flesh some of that out and bring forward their expertise. I find it harder this year because of this format.
I like a Google form, a Google survey form, and sometimes it's like 3 questions, 4 questions, and they might not say, what's your cultural background? They might say like, what are you listening to? Who are you thinking about? What did you do this weekend? What kinds of things would excite you? Or, and you might also say like, I'm going to share with you what I know today about da-da-da-da. So for me, it might be Bharatanatyam. I am not an expert, but the little that I know, I want you to know, and I want to share with you. And if there is somebody in this room that has something that they can offer to the conversation, please share it and understand that there's more information out there. Position yourself as not the expert, but as somebody who's opening space up for others to share, and you're willing to share what you do have.
I love the idea of a forum. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Naya, thank you for a very cogent presentation. And Jared's question actually inspires me to change my question. And that is, we know that DEI will succeed if we have a campus culture that embraces it. And I'm just wondering if you have an opinion of whether or not the students and the faculty share this common culture, or do we have different cultures when it comes to DEI?
I think DEI work is very much like maybe our writing skills on campus, right? There's lots of different levels, and we see lots of students coming in with great writing skills, and we see students coming in with terrible writing skills. And so I think it runs the gamut across the board. And I think one of the challenges is it's very uncomfortable to have low skills in that area, and people don't want to talk about it and they don't want to be exposed. And so that kind of leads to a retreat and not that space to get more skills. So it's definitely something that's valuable. We know that students who graduate from diverse institutions start at a higher ranking salary. So this is something that's actually financially beneficial to students and universities nationally and internationally. But I would say it's not a streamline, everybody comes in with a certain set of information. And I think that we all have blind spots, right? We all have blind spots. And I think that we have to work together as a community, to your point, to see them.
Hello, I have a question about another marginalized group, students and professors with disabilities. Because this is protected class by HIPAA, and also there is fear to be stigmatized, especially if it's mental health issues. How you make disability as an inclusive topic when you are like working on your curriculum? I know that you have disclaimer in each curriculum talking about accommodation, but sometimes some of my students would not disclose that, and I cannot help them and be effective teacher. And I cannot tell them to disclose that disability, or they need special accommodation. But then in the class, I might be unintentionally discriminating them if I, for example, don't allow extension of assignment deadline or stuff like that. What is your approach on that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think transparency is the best way to approach that. I would just be really honest with students and say that you care about students with disabilities, and that if they have them and they want to disclose them or not, you're open and you're welcoming to them. Let them know where you stand. Also centering the stories of people who are disabled or differently abled. I know for me, there's a chapter in my book about creating a repertory piece with a dance member who is differently abled, and shining the light on that voice and experience. It's not only about bringing attention to that story, but if somebody does have a disability, knowing that you are somebody who's open and valuing that background makes you a more open and a person that they see responsive, right? So for example, I did the safe zone training, safe space training, different places call it different things, but for LGBTQIA+ community members, when you have that sticker in your window, some people think it's not a big deal, but if you're a student looking for the sticker, it's a really big deal. So when you make those comments, or maybe you're saying like, you know, please feel free to share your preferred pronoun. And for me, I ask them to write it to me, as opposed to having to proclaim it publicly in case some people are uncomfortable with it. Some people aren't going to share with you that information, but when they know that you're open to it, it changes the way they see you. And it also models something for the other students in the room. So it's not always about you and that student. Sometimes it's about the wider dialogue that's happening. But definitely I look for ways and times to center the bodies of differently abled people. And I try not to only focus and give praise to one type of body and one type of student.
Thank you for speaking with us. My question is, what can students do in situations when the professor might be reluctant to adopt anti-racist curriculum or content? Specifically, I've had an experience in a business class where the professor was educating us on marketing strategies for different races and ethnicities, and that content itself felt bordering on stereotype and racial insensitivity. And I did not know how to talk with the professor about that.
I think there's not a one size fits all, because I think different professors respond differently to that kind of interaction or experience. I would imagine that professor was thinking that they were being very progressive and reaching out and trying to center this, you know, thing. And maybe they haven't worked out all the kinks and they don't know everything, but it really depends on the chemistry of that professor. And it also depends on kind of how much the student wants to put their neck out there and kind of, do I want to come, anonymously or not anonymous? There's a lot of variables that it really, to me, it depends on the situation. But what I would say is, ultimately, I think it's really good information to share with the professor. And sometimes you can slip a note to them anonymously after the course or during the course, or seek out support in the ODI office.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. I want to say thank you so much, Naya, for coming today. That was really wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that information. It was really valuable. And we appreciate your time and effort and energy and wisdom.
Thank
So
you.
thank
Have a great
you.
day.